Saladin.
Ṣalāḥ ad-Dīn Yūsuf ibn Ayyūb, better known in the Western world as Saladin, was the first Sultan of Egypt and Syria and the founder of the Ayyubid dynasty. A Muslim of Kurdish origin, Saladin led the Muslim opposition to the European Crusaders in the Levant. At the height of his power, his sultanate included Egypt, Syria, Mesopotamia, Hejaz, Yemen, and other parts of North Africa. Originally sent to Fatimid Egypt by his Zengid lord Nur ad-Din in 1163, Saladin climbed the ranks of the Fatimid government by virtue of his military successes against Crusader assaults on its territory and his personal closeness to the Caliph al-Ayyubid. When Saladin's uncle Shirkuh died in 1169, al-Ayyubid appointed Saladin vizier, a rare nomination of a Sunni Muslim to such an important position in the Shia Muslim-led caliphate. During his term as vizier, Saladin began to undermine the Fatimid establishment, and following al-Ayyubid's death in 1171, he took over government and realigned the country's allegiance with the Baghdad-based Abbasid Caliphate. In the following years, he led forays against the Crusaders in Palestine, ordered the successful conquest of Yemen and staved off pro-Fatimid rebellions in Upper Egypt. Not long after the death of Nur ad-Din in 1174, Saladin personally led the conquest of Syria, peacefully entering Damascus at the request of its ruler. By mid-1175, Saladin had conquered Hama and Homs, inviting the animosity of his former Zengid lords, who had been the official rulers of Syria. Soon after, he defeated the Zengid army in battle and was thereafter proclaimed the Sultan of Egypt and Syria by the Abbasid Caliph al-Mustadi. He made further conquests in northern Syria and Jazira, escaping 2 attempts on his life by the assassins, before returning to Egypt in 1177 to address issues there. By 1182, Saladin completed the conquest of Syria after capturing Aleppo, but ultimately failed to take over the Zengid stronghold of Mosul. Under Saladin's personal leadership, the Ayyubid army defeated the Crusaders at the decisive Battle of Hattin in 1187, leading the way to the Muslims' recapture of Palestine from the Crusaders who had conquered it 88 years earlier. Though the Crusader Kingdom of Jerusalem would continue to exist for an extended period, its defeat at Hattin marked a turning point in its conflict with the Muslim powers of the region. Saladin has become a prominent figure in Muslim, Arab, and Kurdish culture. His reportedly noble and chivalrous behavior was noted, even by Christian chroniclers, and despite being the nemesis of the Crusaders, he purportedly won the respect of many of them, including Richard the Lionheart, who led the Third Crusade. In 1193 he died in Damascus, having given much of his wealth to his subjects. Saladin is buried in a mausoleum adjacent to the Umayyad Mosque.
Sources.
Among Saladin's admirers who produced personal biographies are the historians, Qadi al-Fadl from Asqalan, Imad al-Din al-Isfahani, and Baha al-Din, a jurist from Mosul. Ibn al-Athir, d. 1233, on the other hand, produced a more hostile picture. Certainly Imad al-Din al-Isfahani shows a deep admiration for Saladin, but his greatness appears wholly as a corollary from the facts themselves. Throughout the Baqi he is presented in human and realistic terms, even more than in Baha al-Din's biography.
Early life.
Saladin was born in Tikrit, Mesopotamia. His personal name was Yūsuf. Ṣalāḥ ad-Din is a laqab, a descriptive epithet, meaning righteousness of the faith. His family was of Kurdish ancestry, and had originated from the city of Dvin in medieval Armenia. The Rawādid tribe he hailed from had been partially assimilated into the Arabic-speaking world by this time. In 1132 the defeated army of the Imad ad-Din Zengi, the lord of Mosul, found their retreat blocked by the Tigris River opposite the Tikrit fortress where Saladin's father, Nam ad-Din Ayyūb, served as the warden. Ayyūb provided ferries for the army and gave them refuge in Tikrit. Mu'at al-Din Bayraz, a former Greek slave who had been appointed the military governor of northern Mesopotamia for his service to the Seljuks, had reprimanded Ayyūb for giving Zengi refuge and in 1137, banished Ayyūb from Tikrit after his brother Asad al-Din Shirkuh killed a friend of Bayraz in an honor killing. According to Baha ad-Din ibn Shaddad, Saladin was born the same night his family left Tikrit. In 1139, Ayyub and his family moved to Mosul where Imad ad-Din Zanji acknowledged his debt and appointed Ayyub commander of his fortress in Baalbek. After the death of Zanji in 1146, his son, Nur ad-Din, became the regent of Aleppo and the leader of the Zengids. Saladin, who now lived in Damascus, was reported to have a particular fondness of the city, but information on his early childhood is scarce. About education, Saladin wrote children are brought up in the way in which their elders were brought up. According to one of his biographers, al-Warani, Saladin was able to answer questions on Euclid, the Almagest, arithmetic, and law, but this was an academic ideal and it was study of the Quran and the sciences of religion that linked him to his contemporaries. Several sources claim that during his studies he was more interested in religion than joining the military. Another factor which may have affected his interest in religion was that during the First Crusade, Jerusalem was taken in a surprise attack by the Christians. In addition to Islam, Saladin had a knowledge of the genealogies, biographies, and histories of the Arabs, as well as the bloodlines of Arabian horses. More significantly, he knew the Hamasa of Abu Tamam by heart. He also spoke Kurdish, and likely Turkish as well.
Early expeditions.
Saladin's military career began under the tutelage of his uncle Asad al-Din Shirkin, an important military commander under Nur ad-Din, emir of Damascus and Aleppo, member of the Turkic Zengid dynasty and the most influential teacher of Saladin. In 1163, the vizier to the Fatimid Caliph al-Adid, Ṣalāḥ, had been driven out of Egypt by rival Diram, a member of the powerful Bani Rosaic tribe. He asked for military backing from Nur ad-Din, who complied and in 1164, sent Shirkuh to aid Ṣalāḥ in his expedition against Diram. Saladin, at age 26, went along with them. After Ṣalāḥ was successfully reinstated as vizier, he demanded that Shirkuh withdraw his army from Egypt for a sum of 30,000 dinars, but he refused, insisting it was Nur ad-Din's will that he remain. Saladin's role in this expedition was minor, and it is known that he was ordered by Shirkuh to collect stores from Bilbays prior to its siege by a combined force of Crusaders and Ṣalāḥ's troops. After the sacking of Bilbays, the Crusader Egyptian force and Shirkuh's army were to engage in a battle on the desert border of the Nile River, just west of Hejaz. Saladin played a major role, commanding the right wing of the Zengid army, Muslim dynasty of Oghuz Turk origin, while a force of Kurds commanded the left, and Shirkuh stationed in the center. Muslim sources at the time, however, put Saladin in the baggage of the center with orders to lure the enemy into a trap by staging a false retreat. The Crusader force enjoyed early success against Shirkuh's troops, but the terrain was too steep and sandy for their horses, and Commander Hugh of Caesarea was captured while attacking Saladin's unit. After scattered fighting in little valleys to the south of the main position, the Zengid central force returned to the offensive. Saladin joined in from the rear. The battle ended in a Zengid victory, and Saladin is credited to have helped Shirkuh in one of the most remarkable victories in recorded history, according to Ibn al-Athir, although more of Shirkuh's men were killed and the battle is considered by most sources as not a total victory. Saladin and Shirkuh moved towards Alexandria where they were welcomed, given money, arms, and provided a base. Faced by a superior Crusader Egyptian force who attempted to besiege the city, Shirkuh split his army. He and the bulk of his force withdrew from Alexandria, while Saladin was left with the task of guarding the city.
In Egypt. Emir of Egypt.
Shirkuh engaged in a power struggle over Egypt with Ṣawā and Amalric I of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, in which Ṣawā requested Amalric's assistance. In 1169, Ṣawā was reportedly assassinated by Saladin, and Shirkuh died later that year. Nur ad-Din chose a successor for Shirkuh, but al-Adid appointed Saladin to replace Ṣawā as vizier. The reasoning behind the Shia Caliph al-Adid's selection of Saladin, a Sunni, varies. Ibn al-Athir claims that the Caliph chose him after being told by his advisors that there is no one weaker or younger than Saladin, and not one of the emirs obeyed him or served him. However, according to this version, after some bargaining, he was eventually accepted by the majority of emirs. Al-Aidid's advisors were also suspected of attempting to split the Syria-based Zengid ranks. Al-Warani wrote that Saladin was selected because of the reputation of his family in their generosity and military prowess. Imad ad-Din wrote that after the brief mourning period of Shirkin, during which opinions differed, the Zengid emirs decided upon Saladin and forced the caliph to invest him as vizier. Although positions were complicated by rival Muslim leaders, the bulk of the Syrian rulers supported Saladin because of his role in the Egyptian expedition, in which he gained a record of military qualifications. Inaugurated as emir on March 26, Saladin repented wine drinking and turned from frivolity to assume the dress of religion. Having gained more power and independence than ever before in his career, he still faced the issue of ultimate loyalty between Al-Aidid and Nur ad-Din. The latter was rumored to be clandestinely hostile towards Saladin's appointment and was quoted as saying, "How dare he do anything without my orders?" He wrote several letters to Saladin, who dismissed them without abandoning his allegiance to Nur ad-Din. Later in the year, a group of Egyptian soldiers and emirs attempted to assassinate Saladin, but having already known of their intentions, thanks to his intelligence chief Ali bin Safian, he had the chief conspirator, Naji, Mu'tamin al-Khalifa, the civilian controller of the Fatimid palace, arrested, and killed. The day after, 50,000 black African soldiers from the regiments of the Fatimid army opposed to Saladin's rule along with a number of Egyptian emirs and commoners staged a revolt. By August 23, Saladin had decisively quelled the uprising, and never again had to face a military challenge from Cairo. Towards the end of 1169, Saladin, with reinforcements from Nur ad-Din, defeated a massive Crusader Byzantine force near Damietta. Afterward, in the spring of 1170, Nur ad-Din sent Saladin's father to Egypt in compliance with Saladin's request, as well as encouragement from the Baghdad-based Abbasid Caliph, al-Mustanjid, who aimed to pressure Saladin in deposing his rival Caliph, al-Aidid. Saladin himself had been strengthening his hold on Egypt and widening his support base there. He began granting his family members high-ranking positions in the region and increased Sunni influence in Cairo. He ordered the construction of a college for the Maliki branch of Sunni Islam in the city, as well as one for the Shafi'i denomination to which he belonged in Al-Fustat. After establishing himself in Egypt, Saladin launched a campaign against the Crusaders, besieging Dahram in 1170. Amalric withdrew his Templar garrison from Gaza to assist him in defending Dahram, but Saladin evaded their force and fell on Gaza instead. He destroyed the town built outside the city's castle and killed most of its inhabitants after they were refused entry into the castle. It is unclear exactly when, but during that same year, he attacked and captured the Crusader castle of Eilat, built on an island off the head of the Gulf of Aqaba. It did not pose a threat to the passage of the Muslim navy, but could harass smaller parties of Muslim ships, and Saladin decided to clear it from his path.
Sultan of Egypt.
According to Imad ad-Din, Nur ad-Din wrote to Saladin in June 1171, telling him to re-establish the Abbasid Caliphate in Egypt, which Saladin coordinated 2 months later after additional encouragement by Nam ad-Din al-Qabashani, the Shafi'i faqih, who vehemently opposed Shia rule in the country. Several Egyptian emirs were thus killed, but al-Aidid was told that they were killed for rebelling against him. He then fell ill, or was poisoned according to one account. While ill, he asked Saladin to pay him a visit to request that he take care of his young children, but Saladin refused, fearing treachery against the Abbasids, and is said to have regretted his action after realizing what al-Aidid had wanted. He died on September 13 and 5 days later, the Abbasid Khutbah was pronounced in Cairo and Al-Fustat, proclaiming al-Mustadi as caliph. On September 25, Saladin left Cairo to take part in a joint attack on Kerak and Montreal, the desert castles of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, with Nur ad-Din who would attack from Syria. Prior to arriving at Montreal, Saladin withdrew, realizing that if he met Nur ad-Din at Shawbak, he would be refused return to Egypt because of Nur ad-Din's reluctance to consolidate such massive territorial control to Saladin. Also, there was a chance that the Crusader kingdom, which acted as a buffer state between Syria and Egypt, could have collapsed had the two leaders attacked it from the east and the coast. This would have given Nur ad-Din the opportunity to annex Egypt. Saladin claimed he withdrew amid Fatimid plots against him, but Nur ad-Din did not accept the excuse. During the summer of 1172, a Nubian army along with a contingent of Armenian refugees were reported on the Egyptian border, preparing for a siege against Aswan. The emir of the city had requested Saladin's assistance and was given reinforcements under Turan Shah, Saladin's brother. Consequently, the Nubians departed, but returned in 1173 and were again driven off. This time Egyptian forces advanced from Aswan and captured the Nubian town of Ibrim. 17 months after al-Adid's death, Nur ad-Din had not taken any action regarding Egypt, but expected some return for the 200,000 dinars he had allocated to shirk his army which seized the country. Saladin paid this debt with 60,000 dinars, wonderful manufactured goods, some jewels, an ass of the finest breed, and an elephant. While transporting these goods to Damascus, Saladin took the opportunity to ravage the Crusader countryside. He did not press an attack against the desert castles, but attempted to drive out the Muslim Bedouins who lived in Crusader territory with the aim of depriving the Franks of guides. On July 31, 1173, Saladin's father Ayyub was wounded in a horse-riding accident, ultimately causing his death on August 9. In 1174, Saladin sent Turan Shah to conquer Yemen to allocate it and its port Aden to the territories of the Ayyubid dynasty. Yemen also served as an emergency territory, to which Saladin could flee in the event of an invasion by Nur ad-Din.
Acquisition of Syria. Capture of Damascus.
In the early summer of 1174, Nur ad-Din was mustering an army, sending summons to Mosul, Diyarbakir, and Al-Jazira in an apparent preparation of attack against Saladin's Egypt. The Ayyubid dynasty held a council upon the revelation of his preparations to discuss the possible threat and Saladin collected his own troops outside Cairo. On May 15, Nur ad-Din died after being poisoned the previous week and his power was handed to his 11-year-old son Assil Ismail al-Malik. His death left Saladin with political independence and in a letter to Assil, he promised to act as a sword against his enemies and referred to the death of his father as an earthquake shock. In the wake of Nur ad-Din's death, Saladin faced a difficult decision. He could move his army against the Crusaders from Egypt or wait until invited by Assil in Syria to come to his aid and launch a war from there. He could also take it upon himself to annex Syria before it could possibly fall into the hands of a rival, but feared that attacking a land that formerly belonged to his master, which is forbidden in the Islamic principles he followed, could portray him as hypocritical and thus, unsuitable for leading the war against the Crusaders. Saladin saw that in order to acquire Syria, he either needed an invitation from Assil or warn him that potential anarchy and danger from the Crusaders could rise. When Assil was removed to Aleppo in August, Gumashtijan, the emir of the city and a captain of Nur ad-Din's veterans assumed guardianship over him. The emir prepared to unseat all of his rivals in Syria and Al-Jazira, beginning with Damascus. In this emergency, the emir of Damascus appealed to Saif al-Din, a cousin of Gumashtijan, of Mosul for assistance against Aleppo, but he refused, forcing the Syrians to request the aid of Saladin who complied. Saladin rode across the desert with 700 picked horsemen, passing through Al-Khirak then reaching Bozrah and according to him, was joined by emirs, soldiers, and Bedouins, the emotions of their hearts to be seen on their faces. On November 23, he arrived in Damascus amid general acclamations and rested at his father's old home there, until the gates of the citadel of Damascus were opened to him 4 days later. He installed himself in the castle and received the homage and salutations of the citizens.
Further conquests.
Leaving his brother Tutijan as governor of Damascus, Saladin proceeded to reduce other cities that had belonged to Nur al-Din, but were now practically independent. His army conquered Hama with relative ease, but avoided attacking Homs because of the strength of his citadel. Saladin moved north towards Aleppo, besieging it on December 30 after Gumashtijan refused to abdicate his throne. As Salih, fearing capture by Saladin, came out of his palace and appealed to the inhabitants not to surrender him and the city to the invading force. One of Saladin's chroniclers claimed the people came under his spell. Gumashtijan requested from Rashid ad-Din Shinan, Grand Master of the Assassins of Syria, who were already at odds with Saladin since he replaced the Fatimids of Egypt, to assassinate Saladin in his camp. On May 11, 1175, a group of 13 assassins easily gained admission into Saladin's camp, but were detected immediately before they carried out their attack by Nasir al-Din Qumatakin of Abu Qubays. One was killed by a general of Saladin and the others was slain while trying to escape. To deter Saladin's progress, Raymond of Tripoli gathered his forces by Nahr al-Kabir where they were well placed for an attack on Muslim territory. Saladin later moved toward Homs instead, but retreated after being told a relief force was being sent to the city by Saif al-Din. Meanwhile, Saladin's rivals in Syria and Jazira waged a propaganda war against him, claiming he had forgotten his own condition, and showed no gratitude for his old master by besieging his son, rising in rebellion against his lord. Saladin aimed to counter this propaganda by ending the siege, claiming he was defending Islam from the Crusaders. His army returned to Hama to engage a Crusader force there. The Crusaders withdrew beforehand and Saladin proclaimed it a victory, opening the gates of men's hearts. Soon after, Saladin entered Homs and captured its citadel in March 1175, after stubborn resistance from its defenders. Saladin's successes alarmed Saif al-Din. As head of the Zengids, including Gumashtijan, he regarded Syria and Mesopotamia as his family estate and was angered when Saladin attempted to usurp his dynasty's holdings. Saif al-Din mustered a large army and dispatched it to Aleppo, whose defenders anxiously had awaited them. The combined forces of Mosul and Aleppo marched against Saladin in Hama. Heavily outnumbered, Saladin initially attempted to make terms with the Zengids by abandoning all conquests north of the Damascus province, but they refused, insisting he return to Egypt. Seeing that confrontation was unavoidable, Saladin prepared for battle, taking up a superior position on the hills by the gorge of the Orontes River. On April 13, 1175, the Zengid troops marched to attack his forces, but soon found themselves surrounded by Saladin's Ayyubid veterans who crushed them. The battle ended in a decisive victory for Saladin, who pursued the Zengid fugitives to the gates of Aleppo, forcing Asila's advisors to recognize Saladin's control of the provinces of Damascus, Homs and Hama, as well as a number of towns outside Aleppo such as Ma'arat al-Numan. After his victory against the Zengids, Saladin proclaimed himself king and suppressed the name of Asila in Friday prayers and Islamic coinage. From then on, he ordered prayers in all the mosques of Syria and Egypt as the sovereign king, and he issued to the Cairo mint gold coins bearing his official title, Al-Malik al-Nasir Yūsuf ibn Ayyūb, Allah the king strong to aid, Joseph son of Job. Exalted be the standard. The Abbasid Caliph in Baghdad graciously welcomed Saladin's assumption of power and declared him Sultan of Egypt and Syria. The Battle of Hama did not end the contest for power between the Ayyubids and the Zengids, with the final confrontation occurring in the spring of 1176. Saladin had gathered massive reinforcements from Egypt while Saif al-Din was levying troops among the minor states of Diyarbakir and Al-Jazira. When Saladin crossed the Orontes, leaving Hama, the sun was eclipsed. He viewed this as an omen, but he continued his march north. He reached the Sultan's Mound, c. 25 kilometers from Aleppo, where his forces encountered Saif al-Din's army. A hand-to-hand fight ensued and the Zengids managed to plough Saladin's left wing, driving it before him, when Saladin himself charged at the head of the Zengid guard. The Zengid forces panicked and most of Saif al-Din's officers ended up being killed or captured. Saif al-Din narrowly escaped. The Zengid army's camp, horses, baggage, tents, and stores were seized by the Ayyubids. The Zengid prisoners of war, however, were given gifts and freed. All of the booty from the Ayyubid victory was accorded to the army, Saladin not keeping anything himself. He continued towards Aleppo, which still closed its gates to him, halting before the city. On the way, his army took Busayr, then captured Manbij. From there they headed west to besiege the fortress of Hejaz on May 15. Several days later, while Saladin was resting in one of his captain's tents, an assassin rushed forward at him and struck at his head with a knife. The cap of his head armor was not penetrated and he managed to grip the assassin's hand, the dagger only slashing his gambeson, and the assailant was soon killed. Saladin was unnerved at the attempt on his life, which he accused Gumashtugan and the assassins of plotting, and so increased his efforts in the siege. Hejaz capitulated on June 21, and Saladin then hurried his forces to Aleppo to punish Gumashtugan. His assaults were again resisted, but he managed to secure not only a truce, but a mutual alliance with Aleppo, in which Gumashtugan and as-Salib were allowed to continue their hold on the city, and in return, they recognized Saladin as the sovereign over all of the dominions he conquered. The emirs of Mardin and Kufa, the Muslim allies of Aleppo, also recognized Saladin as the king of Syria. When the treaty was concluded, the younger sister of as-Salib came to Saladin and requested the return of the fortress of Hejaz. He complied and escorted her back to the gates of Aleppo with numerous presents.
Dispute with the assassins.
Saladin had by now agreed truces with his Zenid rivals, and the Kingdom of Jerusalem, latter occurred in the summer of 1175, but faced a threat from the Ismaili sect known then as the Assassins, led by Rashid ad-Din Shinan. Based in the an-Nasiriyya mountains, they commanded 9 fortresses, all built on high elevations. As soon as he dispatched the bulk of his troops to Egypt, Saladin led his army into the an-Nasiriyya range in August 1176. He retreated the same month, after laying waste to the countryside, but failing to conquer any of the forts. Most Muslim historians claim that Saladin's uncle, the governor of Hama, mediated a peace agreement between him and Shinan. Assassins feared him when he attacked their hideout. He had his guards supplied with link lights and had chalk and cinders strewed around his tent outside Masyaf, which he was besieging, to detect any footsteps by the assassins. According to this version, one night Saladin's guards noticed a spark glowing down the hill of Masyaf and then vanishing among the Ayyubid tents. Presently, Saladin awoke to find a figure leaving the tent. He saw that the lamps were displaced and beside his bed laid hot scones of the shape peculiar to the assassins, with a note at the top pinned by a poisoned dagger. The note threatened that he would be killed if he didn't withdraw from his assault. Saladin gave a loud cry, exclaiming that Shinan himself was the figure that had left the tent. Another version claims that Saladin hastily withdrew his troops from Masyaf because they were urgently needed to fend off a Crusader force in the vicinity of Mount Lebanon. Assassins sought to form an alliance with him, consequently depriving the Crusaders of a potent ally against him. Viewing the expulsion of the Crusaders as a mutual benefit and priority, Saladin and Shinan maintained cooperative relations afterwards, the latter dispatching contingents of his forces to bolster Saladin's army in a number of decisive subsequent battle fronts.
Return to Cairo and forays in Outdoor.
After leaving the an-Nasiriyya mountains, Saladin returned to Damascus and had his Syrian soldiers return home. He left Turan Shah in command of Syria and left for Egypt with only his personal followers, reaching Cairo on September 22. Having been absent roughly 2 years, he had much to organize and supervise in Egypt, namely fortifying and reconstructing Cairo. The city walls were repaired and their extensions laid out, while the construction of the Cairo citadel was commenced. The 280 feet, 85 m, deep Yūsuf, Joseph's well was built on Saladin's orders. The chief public work he commissioned outside of Cairo was the large bridge at Giza, which was intended to form an outwork of defense against a potential Moorish invasion. Saladin remained in Cairo supervising its improvements, building colleges such as the Madrasa of the Swordmakers and ordering the internal administration of the country. In November 1177, he set out upon a raid into Palestine. The Crusaders had recently forayed into the territory of Damascus, so Saladin saw the truce as no longer worth preserving. The Christians sent a large portion of their army to besiege the fortress of Haram north of Aleppo, so southern Palestine bore few defenders. Saladin found the situation ripe and marched to Ascalon, which he referred to as the Bride of Syria. William of Tyre recorded that the Ayyubid army consisted of 26,000 soldiers, of which 8,000 were elite forces and 18,000 were black slave soldiers from Sudan. This army proceeded to raid the countryside, sack Ramla and Lod, and dispersed themselves as far as the gates of Jerusalem.
Battles and truce with Baldwin.
The Ayyubids allowed King Baldwin to enter Ascalon with his Gaza-based Templars without taking any precautions against a sudden attack. Although the Crusader force consisted of only 375 knights, Saladin hesitated to ambush them because of the presence of highly skilled generals. On November 25, while the greater part of the Ayyubid army was absent, Saladin and his men were surprised near Ramla in the Battle of Montjasad. Before they could form up, the Templar force hacked the Ayyubid army down. Initially, Saladin attempted to organize his men into battle order, but as his bodyguards were being killed, he saw that defeat was inevitable, and so with a small remnant of his troops mounted a swift camel, riding all the way to the territories of Egypt. Undiscouraged by his defeat at Tel Jezza, Saladin was prepared to fight the Crusaders once again. In the spring of 1178, he was encamped under the walls of Homs, and a few skirmishes occurred between his generals and the Crusader army. His forces in Hama won a victory over their enemy and brought the spoils, together with many prisoners of war, to Saladin, who ordered the captives to be beheaded for plundering and laying waste the lands of the faithful. He spent the rest of the year in Syria without a confrontation with his enemies. Saladin's intelligence services reported to him that the Crusaders were planning a raid into Syria. He ordered one of his generals, Farrukh Shah, to guard the Damascus frontier with 1,000 of his men to watch for an attack, then to retire, avoiding battle, and to light warning beacons on the hills, after which Saladin would march out. In April 1179, the Crusaders led by King Baldwin expected no resistance and waited to launch a surprise attack on Muslim herders grazing their herds in flocks east of the Golan Heights. Baldwin advanced too rashly in pursuit of Farrukh Shah's force, which was concentrated southeast of Quneitra, and was subsequently defeated by the Ayyubids. With this victory, Saladin decided to call in more troops from Egypt. He requested al-Adil to dispatch 1,500 horsemen. In the summer of 1179, King Baldwin had set up an outpost on the road to Damascus and aimed to fortify a passage over the Jordan River, known as Jacob's Ford, that commanded the approach to the Banias Plain. The plain was divided by the Muslims and the Christians. Saladin had offered 100,000 gold pieces for Baldwin to abandon the project, which was peculiarly offensive to the Muslims, but to no avail. He then resolved to destroy the fortress, called Chastelet and manned by the Templars, moving his headquarters to Banias. As the Crusaders hurried down to attack the Muslim forces, they fell into disorder, with the infantry falling behind. Despite early success, they pursued the Muslims far enough to become scattered, and Saladin took advantage by rallying his troops and charged at the Crusaders. The engagement ended in a decisive Ayyubid victory, and many high-ranking knights were captured. Saladin then moved to besiege the fortress, which fell on August 30, 1179. In the spring of 1180, while Saladin was in the area of Safford, anxious to commence a vigorous campaign against the Kingdom of Jerusalem, King Baldwin sent messengers to him with proposals of peace. Because droughts and bad harvests hampered his commissariat, Saladin agreed to a truce. Raymond of Tripoli denounced the truce but was compelled to accept after an Ayyubid raid on his territory in May and upon the appearance of Saladin's naval fleet off the port of Tartus.
Domestic affairs.
In June 1180, Saladin hosted a reception for Nur al-Din Muhammad, the Arctic Emir of Khifa, at Guqsu, in which he presented him and his brother Abu Bakr presents, valued at over 100,000 dinars according to Imad al-Din. This was intended to cement an alliance with the Arctics and to impress other emirs in Mesopotamia and Anatolia. Previously, Saladin offered to mediate relations between Nur al-Din and Khalij Arslan II, the Seljuk Sultan of Rum, after the two came into conflict. The latter demanded Nur al-Din return the lands given to him as a dowry for marrying his daughter when he received reports that she was being abused and used by him to gain Seljuk territory. Nur al-Din requested Saladin mediate the issue but Arslan refused. After Nur al-Din and Saladin met at Guqsu, the top Seljuk emir, Iqtir al-Din al-Hasan, confirmed Arslan's submission, after which an agreement was drawn up. Saladin was later enraged when he received a message from Arslan accusing Nur al-Din of more abuses against his daughter. He threatened to attack the city of Malatya, saying, "It is 2 days' march for me and I shall not dismount until I am in the city." Alarmed at the threat, the Seljuks pushed for negotiations. Saladin felt that Arslan was correct to care for his daughter, but Nur al-Din had taken refuge with him, and therefore he could not betray his trust. It was finally agreed that Arslan's daughter would be sent away for a year and if Nur al-Din failed to comply, Saladin would move to abandon his support for him. Leaving Farrukh Shah in charge of Syria, Saladin returned to Cairo at the beginning of 1181. According to Abu Shama, he intended to spend the fast of Ramadan in Egypt and then make the Hajj pilgrimage to Mecca in the summer. For an unknown reason he apparently changed his plans regarding the pilgrimage and was seen inspecting the Nile River banks in June. He was again embroiled with a Bedouin. He removed 2/3 of their fiefs to use as compensation for the fief holders at Fayum. The Bedouin were also accused of trading with the Crusaders and consequently, their grain was confiscated and they were forced to migrate westward. Later, Ayyubid warships were waged against Bedouin river pirates who were plundering the shores of Lake Tanis. In the summer of 1181, Saladin's former palace administrator Qaraqosh led a force to arrest Majd al-Din, a former deputy of Turan Shah in the Yemeni town of Zabid, while he was entertaining Imad ad-Din at his estate in Cairo. Saladin's intimates accused Majd al-Din of misappropriating the revenues of Zabid, but Saladin himself believed there was no evidence to back the allegations. He had Majd al-Din released in return for a payment of 80,000 dinars. In addition, other sums were to be paid to Saladin's brothers al-Adil and Taj al-Mulukbiri. The controversial detainment of Majd al-Din was a part of the larger discontent associated with the aftermath of Turan Shah's departure from Yemen. Although his deputies continued to send him revenues from the province, centralized authority was lacking and internal quarrel arose between Is al-Din Uthman of Aden and Hittin of Zabid. Saladin wrote in a letter to al-Adil, "This Yemen is a treasure house. We conquered it, but up to this day we have had no return and no advantage from it. There have been only innumerable expenses, the sending out of troops, and expectations which did not produce what was hoped for in the end."
Imperial expansions. Conquest of Mesopotamian hinterland.
Saif al-Din had died earlier in June 1181 and his brother Is al-Din inherited leadership of Mosul. On December 4, the crown prince of the Zengids, as-Salis, died in Aleppo. Prior to his death, he had his chief officers swear an oath of loyalty to Is al-Din, as he was the only Zengid ruler strong enough to oppose Saladin. Is al-Din was welcomed in Aleppo, but possessing it and Mosul put too great of a strain on his abilities. He thus handed Aleppo to his brother Imad al-Din Zangi, in exchange for Sinjar. Saladin offered no opposition to these transactions in order to respect the treaty he previously made with the Zengids. On May 11, 1182, Saladin along with half of the Egyptian Ayyubid army and numerous non-combatants left Cairo for Syria. On the evening before he departed, he sat with his companions and the tutor of one of his sons quoted a line of poetry, "Enjoy the scent of the oxeye plant of Najd, for after this evening it will come no more." Saladin took this as an evil omen and he never saw Egypt again. Knowing that Crusader forces were massed upon the frontier to intercept him, he took the desert route across the Sinai Peninsula to Ayla at the head of the Gulf of Aqaba. Meeting no opposition, Saladin ravaged the countryside of Montreal, whilst Baldwin's forces watched on, refusing to intervene. He arrived in Damascus in June to learn that Farrukh Shah had attacked the Galilee, sacking Daburiya and capturing Habas Juldek, a fortress of great importance to the Crusaders. In July, Saladin dispatched Farrukh Shah to attack Kaukab al-Hawa. Later, in August, the Ayyubids launched a naval and ground assault to capture Beirut. Saladin led his army in the Bekaa Valley. The assault was leaning towards failure and Saladin abandoned the operation to focus on issues in Mesopotamia. Kukbayri, the emir of Harran, invited Saladin to occupy the Jazeera region, making up northern Mesopotamia. He complied and the truce between him and the Zengids officially ended in September 1182. Prior to his march to Jazeera, tensions had grown between the Zengid rulers of the region, primarily concerning their unwillingness to pay deference to Mosul. Before he crossed the Euphrates, Saladin besieged Aleppo for 3 days, signaling that the truce was over. Once he reached Beira, near the river, he was joined by Kukbayri and Nur al-Din of Hisn Kafur and the combined forces captured the cities of Jazeera, one after the other. First, Edessa fell, followed by Saruj, then Araraquqah, Qarqashiyah and Nisabin. Araraquqah was an important crossing point and held by Qutb al-Din Inal, who had lost Manbij to Saladin in 1176. Upon seeing the large size of Saladin's army, he made little effort to resist and surrendered on the condition that he would retain his property. Saladin promptly impressed the inhabitants of the town by publishing a decree that ordered a number of taxes to be cancelled and erased all mention of them from treasury records, stating the most miserable rulers are those whose purses are fat and their people thin. From Araraquqah, he moved to conquer Al-Fudan, Al-Hussein, Maxim, Durain, Araban, and Koba, all of which swore allegiance to him. Saladin proceeded to take Nisabin, which offered no resistance. A medium-sized town, Nisabin was not of great importance, but it was located in a strategic position between Mardin and Mosul and within easy reach of Diyarbakir. In the midst of these victories, Saladin received word that the Crusaders were raiding the villages of Damascus. He replied, "Let them. Whilst they knock down villages, we are taking cities. When we come back, we shall have all the more strength to fight them." Meanwhile, in Aleppo, the emir of the city Zangi raided Saladin's cities to the north and east, such as Baliz, Manbij, Saruj, Buzayr, Al-Khazin. He also destroyed his own citadel at Hejaz to prevent it from being used by the Ayyubids if they were to conquer it.
Possession of Aleppo.
Saladin turned his attention from Mosul to Aleppo, sending his brother Taj al-Mulukbari to capture Tel Khalid, 130 kilometers northeast of the city. A siege was set, but the governor of Tel Khalid surrendered upon the arrival of Saladin himself on May 17 before a siege could take place. According to Imad ad-Din, after Tel Khalid, Saladin took a detour northwards to Ain Tab, but he gained possession of it when his army turned towards it, allowing to quickly move backward another c. 100 kilometers towards Aleppo. On May 21, he camped outside the city, positioning himself east of the citadel of Aleppo, while his forces encircles the suburb of Banu Qasr to the northeast and Bab Janan to the west. He stationed his men dangerously close to the city, hoping for an early success. Zangi did not offer long resistance. He was unpopular with his subjects and wished to return to his Sinjar, the city he governed previously. An exchange was negotiated where Zangi would hand over Aleppo to Saladin in return for the restoration of his control of Sinjar, Nisabin, and Araraquqah. Zangi would hold these territories as Saladin's vassals on terms of military service. On June 12, Aleppo was formally placed in Ayyubid hands. The people of Aleppo had not known about these negotiations and were taken by surprise when Saladin's standard was hoisted over the citadel. Two emirs, including an old friend of Saladin, Is al-Din Jurdik, welcomed and pledged their service to him. Saladin replaced the Hanafi courts with Shafi'i administration, despite a promise he would not interfere in the religious leadership of the city. Although he was short of money, Saladin also allowed the departing Zangi to take all the stores of the citadel that he could travel with and to sell the remainder, which Saladin purchased himself. In spite of his earlier hesitation to go through with the exchange, he had no doubts about his success, stating that Aleppo was the key to the lands, and this city is the eye of Syria and the citadel is its pupil. For Saladin, the capture of the city marked the end of over 8 years of waiting since he told Farrukh Shah that we have only to do the milking and Aleppo will be ours. After spending one night in Aleppo's citadel, Saladin marched to Harim, near the Crusader-held Antioch. The city was held by Suruk, a minor Mamluk. Saladin offered him the city of Basra and property in Damascus in exchange for Harim, but when Suruk asked for more, his own garrison in Harim forced him out. He was arrested by Saladin's deputy Taqi al-Din on allegations that he was planning to cede Harim to Bahman III of Antioch. When Saladin received its surrender, he proceeded to arrange the defense of Harim from the Crusaders. He reported to the Caliph and his own subordinates in Yemen and Baalbek that was going to attack the Armenians. Before he could move, however, there were a number of administrative details to be settled. Saladin agreed to a truce with Bahman in return for Muslim prisoners being held by him, and then he gave Hejaz to Alam ad-Din Sulayman and Aleppo to Saif al-Din al-Yatskuj. The former was an emir of Aleppo who joined Saladin, and the latter was a former Mamluk of Shirkuh who helped rescue him from the assassination attempt at Hejaz.
Fight for Mosul.
As Saladin approached Mosul, he faced the issue of taking over a large city and justifying the action. The Zengids of Mosul appealed to an-Nasir, the Abbasid Caliph at Baghdad, whose vizier favored them. An-Nasir sent Badr al-Badr, a high-ranking religious figure, to mediate between the two sides. Saladin arrived at the city on November 10, 1182. Izz al-Din would not accept his terms because he considered them disingenuous and extensive, and Saladin immediately laid siege to the heavily fortified city. After several minor skirmishes and a stalemate in the siege that was initiated by the Caliph, Saladin intended to find a way to withdraw without damage to his reputation while still keeping up some military pressure. He decided to attack Sinjar, which was held by Izz al-Din's brother Sharaf al-Din. It fell after a 15-day siege on December 30. Saladin's commanders and soldiers broke their discipline, plundering the city. Saladin only managed to protect the governor and his officers by sending them to Mosul. After establishing a garrison at Sinjar, he awaited a coalition assembled by Izz al-Din consisting of his forces, those from Aleppo, Mardin, and Armenia. Saladin and his army met the coalition at Harran in February 1183, but on hearing of his approach, the latter sent messengers to Saladin asking for peace. Each force returned to their cities, and al-Fadl wrote, "They advanced like men, like women they vanished." On March 2, al-Adil from Egypt wrote to Saladin that the Crusaders had struck the heart of Islam. Reynald de Chatillon had sent ships to the Gulf of Aqaba to raid towns and villages off the coast of the Red Sea. It was not an attempt to extend the Crusader influence into that sea or to capture its trade routes, but merely a piratical move. Nonetheless, Imad al-Din writes the raid was alarming to the Muslims because they were not accustomed to attacks on that sea, and Ibn al-Athir adds that the inhabitants had no experience with the Crusaders either as fighters or traders. Ibn Jubayr was told that 16 Muslim ships were burnt by the Crusaders, who then captured a pilgrim ship and caravan at Adab. He also reported they intended to attack Medina and remove Muhammad's body. Al-Makrizi added to the rumor by claiming Muhammad's tomb was going to be relocated to Crusader territory so Muslims would make pilgrimages there. Fortunately for Saladin, al-Adil had his warships moved from Fustat and Alexandria to the Red Sea under the command of an Armenian mercenary Lulu. They broke the Crusader blockade, destroyed most of their ships, and pursued and captured those who anchored and fled into the desert. The surviving Crusaders, numbered at 170, were ordered to be killed by Saladin in various Muslim cities. From the point of view of Saladin, in terms of territory, the war against Mosul was going well, but he still failed to achieve his objectives and his army was shrinking. Taqi al-Din took his men back to Hama, while Nasir al-Din Muhammad and his forces had left. This encouraged Izz al-Din and his allies to take the offensive. The previous coalition regrouped at Hazam, some 140 kilometers from Harran. In early April, without waiting for Nasir al-Din, Saladin and Taqi al-Din commenced their advance against the coalition, marching eastward to Ras Ali unhindered. By late April, after 3 days of actual fighting, according to Saladin, the Ayyubids had captured Amid. He handed the city to Nur al-Din Muhammad together with its stores, which consisted of 80,000 candles, a tower full of arrowheads, and 1,040,000 books. In return for a diploma granting him the city, Nur al-Din swore allegiance to Saladin, promising to follow him in every expedition in the war against the Crusaders, and repairing damage done to the city. The fall of Ayyubid, in addition to territory, convinced el-Ghazi of Mardin to enter the service of Saladin, weakening al-Din's coalition. Saladin attempted to gain the Caliph and Nasir's support against al-Din by sending him a letter requesting a document that would give him legal justification for taking over Mosul and its territories. Saladin aimed to persuade the Caliph, claiming that while he conquered Egypt and Yemen under the flag of the Abbasids, the Zengids of Mosul openly supported the Seljuks, rivals of the Caliphate, and only came to the Caliph when in need. He also accused al-Din's forces of disrupting the Muslim holy war against the Crusaders, stating they are not content not to fight, but they prevent those who can. Saladin defended his own conduct, claiming that he had come to Syria to fight the Crusaders, end the heresy of the assassins, and stop the wrongdoing of the Muslims. He also promised that if Mosul was given to him, it would lead to the capture of Jerusalem, Constantinople, Georgia, and the lands of the Almohads in the Maghreb, until the word of God is supreme and the Abbasid Caliphate has wiped the world clean, turning the churches into mosques. Saladin stressed that all this would happen by the will of God, and instead of asking for financial or military support from the Caliph, he would capture and give the Caliph the territories of Tikrit, Dakhuk, Khuzestan, Kish Island, and Oman.
Wars against Crusaders.
On September 29, 1182, Saladin crossed the Jordan River to attack Bisan, which was found to be empty. Your next day his forces sacked and burned the town and moved westwards. They intercepted Crusader reinforcements from Karak and Shawbak along the Nablus road and took a number of prisoners. Meanwhile, the main Crusader force under Guy of Lusignan moved from Sfaris to Al-Fula. Saladin sent out 500 skirmishers to harass their forces, and he himself marched to Ain Jalut. When the Crusader force, reckoned to be the largest the kingdom ever produced from its own resources, but still outmatched by the Muslims, advanced, the Ayyubids unexpectedly moved down the stream of Ain Jalut. After a few Ayyubid raids, including attacks on Zirin, Forblet, and Mount Tabor, the Crusaders still were not tempted to attack their main force, and Saladin led his men back across the river once provisions and supplies ran low. Crusader attacks provoked further responses by Saladin. Reynald of Shetland, in particular, harassed Muslim trading and pilgrimage routes with a fleet on the Red Sea, a water route that Saladin needed to keep open. In response, Saladin built a fleet of 30 galleys to attack Beirut in 1182. Reynald threatened to attack the holy cities of Mecca and Medina. In retaliation, Saladin twice besieged Kerak, Reynald's fortress in Old Trajadane, in 1183 and 1184. Reynald responded by looting a caravan of pilgrims on the Hajj in 1185. According to the later 13th century Old French continuation of William of Tyre, Reynald captured Saladin's sister in a raid on a caravan. This claim is not attested in contemporary sources, Muslim or Frankish, however, instead stating that Reynald had attacked a preceding caravan, and Saladin set guards to ensure the safety of his sister and her son, who came to no harm. Following the failure of his Kerak sieges, Saladin temporarily turned his attention back to another long-term project and resumed attacks on the territory of his ad-Din, Mazad ibn Mawdud ibn Zangi, around Mosul, which he had begun with some success in 1182. However, since then, Mazad had allied himself with the powerful governor of Azerbaijan and Jibal, who in 1185 began moving his troops across the Zagros Mountains, causing Saladin to hesitate in his attacks. The defenders of Mosul, when they became aware that help was on the way, increased their efforts, and Saladin subsequently fell ill, so in March 1186 a peace treaty was signed. In July 1187 Saladin captured most of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. On July 4, 1187, at the Battle of Hattin, he faced the combined forces of Guy of Lusignan, king consort of Jerusalem, and Raymond III of Tripoli. In this battle alone the Crusader force was largely annihilated by Saladin's determined army. It was a major disaster for the Crusaders and a turning point in the history of the Crusades. Saladin captured Reynald de Chatillon and was personally responsible for his execution in retaliation for his attacks against Muslim caravans. The members of these caravans had, in vain, besought his mercy by reciting the truce between the Muslims and the Crusaders, but he ignored this and insulted their prophet Muhammad before murdering and torturing a number of them. Upon hearing this, Saladin swore an oath to personally execute Reynald. Guy of Lusignan was also captured. Seeing the execution of Reynald, he feared he would be next. However, his life was spared by Saladin, who said of Reynald, "'T is not the want of kings, to kill kings. But that man had transgressed all bounds, and therefore did I treat him thus."
Capture of Jerusalem.
Saladin had captured almost every Crusader city. Jerusalem capitulated to his forces on Friday 2 October 1187, after a siege. When the siege had started, Saladin was unwilling to promise terms of quarter to the Frankish inhabitants of Jerusalem. Balian of Abelin threatened to kill every Muslim hostage, estimated at 5,000, and to destroy Islam's holy shrines of the Dome of the Rock and the Al-Aqsa Mosque if such quarter were not provided. Saladin consulted his council and the terms were accepted. The agreement was read out through the streets of Jerusalem so that everyone might within 40 days provide for himself and pay to Saladin the agreed tribute for his freedom. An unusually low ransom for the times, around $50 in modern times, was to be paid for each Frank in the city, whether man, woman, or child, but Saladin, against the wishes of his treasurers, allowed many families who could not afford the ransom to leave. Patriarch Heraclius of Jerusalem organized and contributed to a collection that paid the ransoms for about 18,000 of the poorer citizens, leaving another 15,000 to be enslaved. Saladin's brother Al-Adil asked Saladin for 1,000 of them for his own use and then released them on the spot. Most of the foot soldiers were sold into slavery. Upon the capture of Jerusalem, Saladin summoned the Jews and permitted them to resettle in the city. In particular, the residents of Ashkelon, a large Jewish settlement, responded to his request. Tyre, on the coast of modern-day Lebanon, was the last major Crusader city that was not captured by Muslim forces. Strategically, it would have made more sense for Saladin to capture Tyre before Jerusalem. Saladin, however, chose to pursue Jerusalem first because of the importance of the city to Islam. Tyre was commanded by Conrad of Montferrat, who strengthened its defences and withstood 2 sieges by Saladin. In 1188, at Tortosa, Saladin released Guy of Lusignan and returned him to his wife, Queen Sibylla of Jerusalem. They went first to Tripoli, then to Antioch. In 1189, they sought to reclaim Tyre for their kingdom but were refused admission by Conrad, who did not recognize Guy as king. Guy then set about besieging Acre. Saladin was on friendly terms with Queen Tamar of Georgia. Saladin's biographer Bahā ad-Din ibn Sayyad reports that, after Saladin's conquest of Jerusalem, the Georgian queen sent envoys to the Sultan to request the return of confiscated possessions of the Georgian monasteries in Jerusalem. Saladin's response is not recorded, but the queen's efforts seem to have been successful as Jacques de Vitry, the bishop of Acre, reports the Georgians were, in contrast to the other Christian pilgrims, allowed a free passage into the city with their banners unfurled. Ibn Sayyad furthermore claims that Queen Tamar outbid the Byzantine emperor in her efforts to obtain the relics of the True Cross, offering 200,000 gold pieces to Saladin who had taken the relics as booty at the Battle of Hattin, but to no avail.
Third Crusade.
Hattin and the fall of Jerusalem prompted the Third Crusade, 1189 to 1192, financed in England by a special Saladin tithe. Richard I of England, Richard the Lionheart, led Guy's siege of Acre, conquered the city and executed 3,000 Muslim prisoners, including women and children. Bahā ad-Din wrote, Saladin retaliated by killing all Franks captured from August 28 to 10 September. Bahā ad-Din wrote, whilst we were there they brought 2 Franks to the Sultan, Saladin, who had been made prisoners by the advance guard. He had them beheaded on the spot. The armies of Saladin engaged in combat with the army of King Richard at the Battle of Arsuf on September 7, 1191, at which Saladin's forces were defeated. After the Battle of Arsuf, Richard moved his forces towards Ascalon. Anticipating Richard's next move, Saladin emptied the city and camped a few miles away. When Richard arrived at the city, he was stunned to see it abandoned and the towers demolished. The next day, when Richard was preparing to retreat to Jaffa, Saladin attacked his army. After a furious battle, Richard managed to save some of his troops and retreated to Ascalon. This was the last major battle between the two forces. All military attempts and battles made by Richard the Lionheart to retake Jerusalem were defeated and failed. Richard only had 2,000 fit soldiers and 50 fit knights to use in battle. With such a small force, he could not expect or hope to take Jerusalem, although he got near enough to see the Holy City. Saladin's relationship with Richard was complicated despite their military rivalry. At Arsuf, when Richard lost his horse, Saladin sent him 2 replacements. Richard proposed that his sister, Joan of England, Queen of Sicily, should marry Saladin's brother and that Jerusalem could be their wedding gift. However, the two men never met face to face and communication was either written or by messenger. As leaders of their respective factions, the two men came to an agreement in the Treaty of Ramla in 1192, whereby Jerusalem would remain in Muslim hands but would be open to Christian pilgrimages. The treaty reduced the Latin kingdom to a strip along the coast from Tyre to Jaffa.
Death.
Saladin died of a fever on March 4, 1193, at Damascus, not long after Richard's departure. In Saladin's possession at the time of his death were 1 piece of gold and 40 pieces of silver. He had given away his great wealth to his poor subjects, leaving nothing to pay for his funeral. He was buried in a mausoleum in the garden outside the Umayyad Mosque in Damascus, Syria. 7 centuries later, Emperor Wilhelm II of Germany donated a new marble sarcophagus to the mausoleum. The sarcophagus was not replaced, however. Instead, the mausoleum, which is opening to visitors, now has 2 sarcophagi, the marble one placed on the side and the original wooden one, which covers Saladin's tomb. Muslims are buried in a simple shroud, so if there are any sarcophagi present, they are usually used for covering the top of the Islamic burials.
Family.
According to Imad al-Din, Saladin had fathered 5 sons before he left Egypt in 1174. Saladin's oldest son, al-Ufdal, was born in 1170 and Uthman was born in 1172 to Shamsa, who accompanied Saladin to Syria. Saladin had a 3rd son named Al-Zayir-Ghazi, who later became Lord of Aleppo. Al-Ufdal's mother bore Saladin another child in 1177. A letter preserved by Kalkhas-Handi records that a 12th son was born in May 1178, while on Imad al-Din's list, he appears as Saladin's 7th son. Masut was born in 1175 and Yaqqa in 1176, the latter to Shamsa.
Recognition and legacy. Muslim world.
In 1898, German Emperor Wilhelm II visited Saladin's tomb to pay his respects. The visit, coupled with anti-imperialist sentiments, led nationalist Arabs to reinvent the image of Saladin and portray him as a hero of the struggle against the West. The image of Saladin they used was the romantic one created by Walter Scott and other Europeans in the West at the time, and conveniently ignored Saladin's Kurdish ethnicity. It replaced Saladin's reputation as a figure who had been largely forgotten in the Muslim world, eclipsed by more successful figures such as Baybars of Egypt. Modern Arab states have sought to commemorate Saladin through various measures, often based on the image created of him in the 19th century West. A governorate centered around Tikrit and Samarra in modern-day Iraq, Salah ad-Din Governorate, is named after him, as is Salahuddin University in Arbel, the largest city of Iraqi Kurdistan. A suburb community of Arbel, Massif Salahuddin, is also named after him. Few structures associated with Saladin survive within modern cities. Saladin first fortified the citadel of Cairo, 1175 to 1183, which had been a domed pleasure pavilion with a fine view in more peaceful times. In Syria, even the smallest city is centered on a defensible citadel, and Saladin introduced this essential feature to Egypt. Although the Ayyubid dynasty that he founded would only outlive him by 57 years, the legacy of Saladin within the Arab world continues to this day. With the rise of Arab nationalism in the 20th century, particularly with regard to the Arab-Israeli conflict, Saladin's heroism and leadership gained a new significance. Saladin's recapture of Palestine from the European Crusaders is considered an inspiration for modern-day Arabs' opposition to Zionism. Moreover, the glory and comparative unity of the Arab world under Saladin was seen as the perfect symbol for the new unity sought by Arab nationalists, such as Gamal Abdel Nasser. For this reason, the eagle of Saladin became the symbol of revolutionary Egypt, and was subsequently adopted by several other Arab states, the United Arab Republic, Iraq, Libya, the partially recognized state of Palestine, and Yemen.
Western world.
His fierce struggle against the Crusaders and his prodigality were where Saladin achieved a great reputation in Europe as a chivalrous knight, so much so that there existed by the 14th century an epic poem about his exploits. Though Saladin faded into history after the Middle Ages, he appears in a sympathetic light in Guthold Ephraim Lessing's play Nathan the Wise, 1779, and in Sir Walter Scott's novel The Talisman, 1825. It is mainly from these texts that the contemporary view of Saladin originates. According to Jonathan Riley Smith, Scott's portrayal of Saladin was that of a modern liberal European gentleman, beside whom medieval Westerners would always have made a poor showing. Despite the Crusaders' slaughter when they originally conquered Jerusalem in 1099, Saladin granted amnesty and free passage to all common Catholics and even to the defeated Christian army, as long as they were able to pay the aforementioned ransom. The Greek Orthodox Christians were treated even better, because they often opposed the Western Crusaders. An interesting view of Saladin and the world in which he lived is provided by Tariq Ali's novel The Book of Saladin. Notwithstanding the differences in beliefs, the Muslim Saladin was respected by Christian lords, Richard especially. Richard once praised Saladin as a great prince, saying that he was without doubt the greatest and most powerful leader in the Islamic world. Saladin in turn stated that there was not a more honorable Christian lord than Richard. After the treaty, Saladin and Richard sent each other many gifts as tokens of respect, but never met face to face. In April 1191, a Frankish woman's 3-month-old baby had been stolen from her camp and had been sold on the market. The Franks urged her to approach Saladin herself with her grievance. According to Baha al-Din, Saladin used his own money to buy the child back. At the end of World War I, British Commander General Edmund Allenby had succeeded in capturing Damascus from Turkish troops. According to some sources, after his triumphal entry into the city, Allenby raised his sword in salute to the famous statue of Saladin and proudly declared, "Today the wars of the Crusaders are completed." This quotation was incorrectly attributed to Allenby, and throughout his life he vehemently protested against his conquest of Palestine in 1917 having been called a crusade. In 1933 Allenby reiterated this stance by saying, "The importance of Jerusalem lay in its strategic importance. There was no religious impulse in this campaign." The British press continued to celebrate his victory over the Ottoman Empire by printing cartoons of Richard the Lionheart looking down on Jerusalem from the heavens with the caption reading, "At last my dream has come true."